Hello and welcome to another episode of Ask the Consistory. I'm your host for this video, Reverend Jake Zabel of the St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church located in Dalby, Queensland, Australia, a member congregation of the Confessional Orthodox Evangelical Lutheran Communion. So welcome to part 2 of my videos on the topic of lay consecration. So in these times of COVID-19, people can't get to church, they can't receive Holy Communion, and so some people have asked, why can't lay people just consecrate the elements in their own homes? And I'm here to explain to you why they can't. And so I'm doing that through this 3-part series on the question of lay consecration. In my previous video, I responded to some of the basic arguments put forth by proponents of lay consecration. In this video, I'm going to be looking at one of the proof texts put forth by proponents of lay consecration. Before I begin, I'd like to point out that these arguments that I am putting forth in these videos are actual arguments put forth by proponents of lay consecration. I've had these arguments thrown at me in conversations with proponents of lay consecration. I've also seen them written in papers and books written by proponents of lay consecration. And so in this video, we're going to be looking at a proof text put forth by proponents of lay consecration to try and argue that the practice of lay consecration is in fact biblical. And this is, yes, an actual proof text put forth by proponents of lay consecration. This particular Bible verse, which is Acts chapter 2 verse 46, although it only makes sense with regards to Acts chapter 2 verse 42, is actually being quoted by Reverend Vernon Grieger in his book, The Lay Communion Controversy, page 141. See, Acts chapter 2 verse 42 says that they, that's the Christians, devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and the prayers. And Acts chapter 2 verse 46 adds that day by day they attended the temple together and broke bread in their own homes. So here we can see that in the early days of the church, the Christians were gathering together in their own homes and practicing Holy Communion on a daily basis. Now, Vernon Grieger in his book wrote concerning this, these early Christians celebrated the sacrament daily from house to house. There is absolutely nothing to say that the sacrament had to be consecrated by one of the 12 apostles. It was obviously administered by laymen in their houses. So here, the proponents of lay consecration have said, well, the people in the early church were having daily communion in their own homes. The text says nothing about the apostles consecrating the elements, so therefore we just assume that the lay people were administering the sacraments themselves. In fact, it actually says it was obviously administered by lay people. So he's saying that if you read this text, not only does it not say the apostles consecrated, in his view, it is obvious that the lay people were consecrating the elements. This argument is based on silence and assumption. Firstly, the proponents of lay consecration state that the text does not mention the apostles, and they just assume that a pastor was not needed to consecrate. Because the text doesn't mention that a pastor consecrated, therefore, well, we don't need a pastor to consecrate. That is an argument on silence, because you're just assuming no pastor was there. It is quite possible that pastors were there. Their argument works on the fact that at this point in time, there were over 3,000 members in the church. And they say that, well, logically, 12 apostles couldn't serve 3,000 Christians on a daily basis. So let us address this argument. This argument is based purely on the fact that the text says nothing about pastors consecrating. Therefore, they just assume that pastors didn't consecrate. But this argument ignores all the other verses that I mentioned in my previous video that says that it is the pastors who are to do the consecrating. They just assume that because the text does not explicitly say a pastor consecrated the elements, that therefore lay people did it. Secondly, this text is not talking about the office of the ministry, and so therefore it shouldn't be used as a proof text regarding the office of the ministry and the consecration of the elements. To use Acts chapter 2 verse 46 to prove lay consecration is the same as the proponents of women ordination using Galatians chapter 3 verse 28, no longer male or female, to prove women's ordination. Galatians chapter 3 verse 28 is not talking about the office of the ministry. It's talking about salvation, and therefore it cannot be used as a proof text for the ordination of women. So too, the Acts chapter 2 verse 46 is not talking about God instituting the office of the ministry to administer the sacraments. It's just talking about a historical event that happened in the early church, which was Christians gathered in their own houses to have Holy Communion on a daily basis. It is not a text that talks about the office of the ministry and the consecration of the elements. Therefore, it cannot be used as a proof text to support the argument either for or against lay consecration. Now, to address the second argument, the proponents of lay consecration just assume that lay people were consecrating the elements because, well, logically, 12 apostles can't serve 3,000 people on a daily basis. Firstly, you don't know how many people were gathering in these houses. I mean, you take 3,000 Christians, divide that by 12, that's like 250 people per house. You think a pastor can't serve 250 people? The apostles separated themselves and went to 12 different houses. They could easily serve 250 people. But this also says on a daily basis. I mean, who said that the pastor only went to one house? There's 12 apostles. There's only 3,000 people. Like I said, that's about 250 to 300 people per apostle. You could have multiple small gatherings in different houses. Nothing says that the pastor only... Nothing says in the text that the apostles only held one service in a house per day. They may have gone to half a dozen or more houses, given people Holy Communion. So it's actually quite feasible for 12 apostles to serve 3,000 people. But let's actually keep looking at this. These proponents of lay consecration just assume that it's impossible for 12 apostles to consecrate the elements for 3,000 Christians. This is an argument based purely on reason and not actually based on the text itself. The text does not say lay people consecrated. You've just made an assumption based on your own human reason, and that is rationalism. That is not keeping with what the scripture says. Now, in addition to this, who says that it was only the 12 apostles consecrating the elements? See, firstly, if you look at Luke chapter 10 verse 1, Jesus ordained 72 other men as ministers. And in Acts chapter 1 verse 15, when Peter addresses the crowd of 120 men, he says to them that the people who is to replace Judas must be a follower of Jesus. And we can most likely assume that of these 120 men, that at least some of them were from the 72, if not all the 72 were there. In fact, the church tradition actually believes that both Joseph and Matthias, who were put forth to replace Judas, were actually originally part of the 72 men ordained in Luke chapter 10. It wasn't just the 12 apostles here in Jerusalem. There is a possible additional 72 pastors roaming around. Now, even if we ignore that, because that is based on assumptions itself, we do know that the apostles were in the habit of ordaining more men when they needed them. If you go to Acts chapter 14 verse 23, we see that the apostles appointed pastors in the towns where they were establishing new churches. Whenever the apostles built a new church, they went and ordained men from amongst those people to serve those churches. And we also know from Acts chapter 15 verse 2 that when Paul and Barnabas went to Jerusalem, they consulted with the apostles and the pastors of Jerusalem. So this shows us that it wasn't just the 12 apostles in Jerusalem, but there were additional pastors in Jerusalem, possibly from the 72 ordained by Jesus in Luke chapter 10, or possibly other men that had been ordained by the apostles. So, like I said, this argument from the proponents of lay consecration have just said, well, there were 3,000 Christians in Jerusalem, they have communion on a daily basis. Logically, it's impossible for a pastor to serve that many people, so therefore the lay people were just obviously consecrating. This ignores the fact that there's 3,000 people, there's 12 apostles, that's like 250 people per apostle. Each apostle could go to several different houses each day to commune, small groups of like 50 or so people. And that also ignores that there were also the 72 men ordained by Jesus, and it also ignores the fact that the apostles were in the habit of ordaining more people to serve in the office of the ministry when they needed them. So it is quite feasible for the apostles to actually go and consecrate the elements in all these houses on a daily basis for 3,000 or more Christians. And so, no, it is not obvious that a layperson did this. And arguing that lay consecration is permissible simply because the text does not say a pastor consecrated the elements is just foolishness. And so I'm just going to leave it at that, and that wraps up part 2 for this discussion on lay consecration. Join us for our third and final installment on this series, where we discuss the topic of lay consecration in emergencies. I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye and God bless.